So, on Battle Analysis, we've been inching closer and closer to what would be considered the midpoint of the Clone Wars, the center of the conflict, and I figured it was a good time to take a look at the state of the war since those early days when we last did one of these overviews. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So if you remember, the start of the Clone Wars was characterized by large Separatist advances, massive offensives spurring out from Separatist space, catching Republic forces off guard, while the Republic tried to come into the logistics of owning a large army and fighting a galactic war. But now this war is over a year old, and it's time to discuss what the conflict looks like now. So in the aftermath of those early Separatist offenses, the Republic began getting better and better at holding their ground, with Republic forces doing a better job facing off against Separatist advances, and ultimately holding the line, even carrying out some of their own counteroffensives, which, while they were present in the early days of the war, were becoming more and more present in the middle portion of the war. During this time, the battles remained in the same section of the galaxy, in the mid-rim and around the fringes of the outer rim where Separatist forces advanced in the early days, but they were starting to creep backwards now. These major offensives into Republic space were over, with Separatist forces now being drawn rather thin as more and more clone troopers arrive at the battlefield. Now, it's worth noting, as many will likely point out, there were vast numbers of battle droids and a much smaller number of clone troopers serving the Republic, but the individual clone troopers were far better soldiers than B-1 or B-2 battle droids. As such, the sort of combat capability of Republic troops was significantly inflated by the capability of their infantry. All of this basically means that as the clone troopers became a more and more frequent sight on the battlefields of the Clone Wars, the battles started shifting to more of a stalemate. The stalemate portion of the war basically saw neither side making major advances, and instead battles being fought on a much smaller scale, while the larger scale battles remained relatively stagnant. So, a lot of the battles we've been talking about in Battle Analysis represent attempts to break this stalemate. As things entered a stalemate, the Separatists began carrying out more desperate attacks, hitting things like Camino, for example, or working with more independent militias and local resistance groups to try to disrupt Republic supply lines, or shape the front line by simply changing the allegiance of worlds along that border. This is where we get situations like the Battle of Umbara, where the Umbarans shifted sides in the conflict at about the midpoint of the war, or the Battle of Camino, which we did talk about last time because it was technically in the early stages of the war, but along that same vein, attacks designed not to necessarily grab territory, but to instead disrupt the Republic's ability to fight a war. We also see a lot of unique plots during this time period, from both sides, more commonly from the Separatists, though, to disrupt the functionality of the Republic government. This includes things like assassination attempts against Republic leadership, including Chancellor Palpatine himself. All in all, this middle section of the war can be sort of summed up by the Separatists starting to become desperate, and starting to look outside the box for solutions for gaining the upper hand in the ongoing war, which was starting to look increasingly grim for them. The Separatists started to have trouble swaying civilian populations over to their side. In the early days of the war, in the wake of the Separatist crisis, there was a significant political push from the Separatists to join the CIS. And this was met relatively favorably by a lot of neutral worlds who saw the CIS as a very legitimate option for their future, and they saw the potential for the CIS winning the war, especially as the reports of the clone army's very existence were in doubt. But as the war dragged on, it became more apparent that the Separatists weren't just going to steamroll the Republic and gain their own independence. The situation started to shift. These neutral worlds started to opt more and more to remain neutral, or even join the side of the Republic. Now, let's talk about civilians. The civilian populations would have changed significantly. During the early days of the war, the Republic would have been gripped by fear. Fear that the Separatists were going to drive a spike right through the center of Republic space and claim victory, maybe even subjugate citizens of the Republic itself. That fear has mostly dissipated, with the Republic forces now being able to hold the line, and most major Separatist offensives having ground to a halt. The conflict became one of attrition, with Republic citizens at this time being a lot more in favor for continuing the conflict, seeing the Separatists as a breakaway state that needs to be repatriated, and a ongoing war as a necessity that doesn't necessarily pose a risk to the daily lives of the civilians in the core worlds. On the flip side, the Separatists are starting to get a little bit, well, disillusioned. Their cause seemed righteous at the start of the conflict, and their military capabilities seemed unquestionable at the start of the war. But as the conflict dragged on and the Separatists started to see defeat on the battlefield, their population would have started to become a little bit disillusioned with the war and unsatisfied with the course of the conflict, and they would start fearing, at the end of the day, defeat. Now, it should be noted that they're not feeling quite as desperate as Republic civilians would have felt in the opening days of the conflict, where Separatist warships over their planet seemed imminent. They were still concerned. They would still look at the reports from the battlefield and see a war that was clearly not going well for their side, and maybe wonder if they bet on the wrong horse. But to understand this in context, you must look at the war as a whole, including the first year of the conflict, which saw the Separatists making significant gains in their war against the Republic. If you'd like to learn about what the opening days of the Clone Wars looked like from a strategic standpoint, I'll leave a link up here to one of my videos breaking down the first year of the conflict. And I want you to let me know down in the comments whether you think the average Separatist citizen would have had hope for victory at this point, or do you think they would have started to believe that their cause's best sort of outcome would be suing for peace, as opposed to going for total victory against the Republic? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.